true crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crimes are
Chapter 1.
real.
Pinkville. On the morning of March 16, 1968, helicopters carried American infantry aboard a cluster of hamlets in Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. They belonged to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, part of the 11th Infantry Brigade of the Americal Division. Their objective was an area the Americans commonly called Pinkville, a name taken from the reddish color used to mark the densely populated region on military maps. Intelligence indicated that Viet Cong guerrillas were concentrated there. The men had been told to expect a fight. Charlie Company had been in Vietnam only a few months, but the war had already become something different from what many of its soldiers expected. They rarely saw the enemy they were supposed to destroy. Instead, they moved through villages, rice paddies and trails where mines and booby traps could kill without warning. Men were wounded by unseen explosives. Friends disappeared from the company roster without ever facing an identifiable opponent. The frustration accumulated. The unit had trained together in Hawaii before deploying. Captain Ernest Medina, its commander, had a reputation as forceful and demanding. But under enough pressure, loyalty to the group had become dangerous. The men increasingly operated in a landscape where the distinction between civilian and enemy had blurred. Quang Ngai Province was considered a center of Viet Cong activity. American units had repeatedly encountered mines and guerrillas there, and local civilians were often suspected of supporting the insurgency. Villages could appear peaceful by day while guerrillas moved through them at night. For soldiers who could not reliably identify who was fighting them, suspicion began replacing certainty. By March 1968, some of the men preparing to enter My Lai had begun thinking of civilians as part of the enemy. On March 15, Charlie Company held a memorial service for a sergeant recently killed in action. The next day's operation was presented as a chance to strike back. Intelligence suggested a Viet Cong force would be in the area. Civilians, the soldiers were led to believe, would have gone to market or otherwise left before the attack. What remained would therefore be hostile, or at least that was the assumption filtering through the unit. Exactly what Medina told his men at the briefing later became one of the most disputed questions in the case. Soldiers remembered his words differently. Medina denied ordering the murder of civilians. The Army's later investigation concluded, however, that as orders passed down the chain of command they were amplified until many soldiers believed virtually everyone encountered in the target area could be treated as the enemy. My Lai was not a case in which an infantry unit came under heavy fire and civilians died in the chaos. The Americans entered expecting resistance, but encountered almost none. The Peers inquiry later determined that American troops were not fired upon during the operation. Only a tiny number of actual Viet Cong were identified and killed in the area, shot by helicopter crews while fleeing. The infantrymen entering My Lai were not fighting through an enemy position. Shortly before the assault, artillery struck around the target area. Helicopters then placed Charlie Company northwest of the village. The landing zone was quiet. No bullets came toward the aircraft. No Viet Cong force emerged. Instead, soldiers found civilians beginning an ordinary morning. The villagers included elderly people, women and children. Some moved toward shelters, while others watched the Americans arrive. The absence of an enemy should have changed the operation immediately. It did not. 1st Platoon was commanded by 2nd Lieutenant William Laws Calley Jr., a young officer whose name would eventually become inseparable from My Lai. He was particularly important within the military, a junior officer leading soldiers into a village they had been conditioned to regard as hostile. What happened next became one of the worst American atrocities of the Vietnam War. But beginning with Calley alone makes the story easier than it really is. My Lai involved individual decisions, but also commanders, failures of leadership, revenge, dehumanization and a chain of authority in which dangerous ideas had been allowed to become normal. The Army's own later inquiry would identify failures stretching far beyond a single lieutenant and his platoon. There were soldiers who refused to kill. There were soldiers who participated. There were men outside Charlie Company who recognized almost immediately that something was terribly wrong. Afterward, there would be officers who had opportunities to expose what happened and did not. But at 7:30 that morning, that history had yet been written. Charlie Company was on the ground. The village was in front of them. The enemy they had been promised was nowhere to be seen. Then the shooting started. Chapter 2: The Killing. The first Americans entering My Lai found no enemy force waiting for them. There was no organized resistance and no incoming fire. Yet within minutes, members of Charlie Company were shooting civilians who ran from them and gathering others into groups. Lieutenant William Calley, commanding 1st Platoon, ordered villagers killed. Some soldiers obeyed immediately. Others hesitated or refused, while Calley himself took part. The killings were not civilians accidentally caught in a firefight. Soldiers entered homes and shelters, threw grenades into bunkers, burned huts and shot people trying to escape. The Army's later investigation found that American troops were not fired upon during the operation. The enemy force they had been told to expect simply was not there. That distinction is essential to understanding My Lai. This was not a battle that became chaotic and impossible to control. The soldiers arrived anticipating combat, encountered overwhelmingly unarmed civilians, and continued treating the village as though everyone inside it could be considered hostile. The absence of resistance did not stop the operation from becoming more violent. Calley's platoon forced villagers from their homes and collected them in groups. Women, children and elderly people were among those pushed toward an irrigation ditch. Soldiers later disagreed over exactly how some orders were worded, but there was little disagreement over what followed. Calley ordered the prisoners killed, and members of his platoon opened fire. Not everyone complied. Some men refused to shoot. Others fired away from civilians or avoided participating when they could. One soldier eventually shot himself in the foot badly enough to be evacuated. The later Army inquiry identified him as the only American casualty of the operation. He had not been wounded by the enemy, because the unit had faced virtually no enemy fire. The violence was also impossible to dismiss as something occurring secretly inside one building. Soldiers moved through an open village while houses burned and gunfire continued. Bodies were visible from the air. Ground units, command personnel and helicopters were all operating in the area. People outside Calley's platoon had opportunities to see that something had gone badly wrong. Army photographer Ronald Ridenhour was among those present. He carried an Army-issued black-and-white camera as well as his own camera loaded with color film. He photographed civilians and soldiers during the operation. The color photographs he kept would later become some of the defining images of the Vietnam War, but the American public would not see them until long after the massacre itself had been buried in official reports. The Vietnamese memorial at My Lai records 504 people killed. The victims included large numbers of women, children and elderly people. American estimates varied, but once the massacre was investigated there was no credible argument that this had simply been the normal civilian toll of a military engagement. Hundreds of unarmed people had been deliberately killed. The scale of the violence raises a harder question than why Calley gave criminal orders. It asks why so many people followed them. Charlie Company had been operating in an environment of anger, fear and dehumanization. Soldiers had lost friends to mines and booby traps. Vietnamese civilians were routinely suspected of assisting the Viet Cong. Orders had been passed downward through a command structure in which aggressive language became broader and more dangerous at each level. None of that excused murder, but it helped create a situation in which some soldiers were prepared to see an entire village as the enemy. Leadership failed at several levels. Calley ordered killings and participated in them. Soldiers made individual decisions to obey or refuse. Officers above him had a responsibility to control their men and understand what was happening in the operation. The Army's later investigation would conclude that the disaster extended well beyond the actions of a single lieutenant. My Lai was therefore both a collection of individual crimes and a command failure. It demonstrated how quickly the distinction between civilian and enemy could disappear when commanders tolerated it, and how easily obedience could become a defense after the fact. Yet the massacre was not inevitable, because several Americans at My Lai recognized immediately that what they were seeing was wrong. One of them was circling above the village in a small observation helicopter. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. could see bodies below, and he could also see American soldiers continuing to move through the area. What he witnessed did not resemble a battle. Soon Thompson would have to decide whether stopping American soldiers from killing Vietnamese civilians meant confronting his own side. Chapter 3, Hugh Thompson. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. was flying a small OH-23 reconnaissance helicopter over My Lai with Crew Chief Glenn Androtter and Door Gunner Lawrence Colburn. Their job was to locate enemy positions and mark them for American ground forces. Instead, as they repeatedly passed over the village, they saw bodies appearing in places they had flown over only minutes earlier. Thompson initially thought artillery might be responsible. Then he began seeing something much harder to explain. Thompson landed near a wounded Vietnamese woman and marked her position so she could receive medical help. After taking off again, the crew saw an American officer approach her. From the helicopter, they watched as the officer killed her. Thompson was becoming convinced that the civilians below were not casualties of combat. American soldiers were deliberately killing them. Flying farther over the village, Thompson saw bodies piled in an irrigation ditch. Some people were still alive among them. He landed and confronted Lieutenant William Calley, asking whether the wounded civilians could be helped. The exchange went nowhere. Thompson returned to his helicopter knowing that the men responsible for the killing were not going to stop simply because another American had challenged them. Then Thompson's crew spotted a group of Vietnamese civilians hiding in a bunker while American soldiers approached. Thompson made an extraordinary decision. He landed his helicopter between the civilians and the advancing Americans, then ordered Colburn and Androtter to cover him. If the soldiers opened fire on the villagers, Thompson told his crew, they were to fire on the Americans. It is difficult to overstate what that meant. Thompson was a warrant officer confronting infantrymen from his own army in the middle of a combat operation. He could not know whether they would obey him, ignore him or shoot him. Yet he had reached the point where protecting civilians from American troops required being prepared to use force against those troops. Thompson approached the soldiers and told them he intended to remove the civilians. He radioed for larger helicopters to land and evacuate them. 2 aircraft eventually carried a group of villagers away from the killing area. Thompson and his crew then returned to the ditch, where Androtter noticed movement among the bodies. He climbed down and found a small child alive beneath the dead. Androtter carried the child out and handed him up to the helicopter crew, who flew him to safety. Thompson did not treat what he had witnessed as something to be quietly forgotten. After leaving the village, he reported the killings through his aviation chain of command. His report helped bring the operation to a halt. By then, however, hundreds of people were already dead, and stopping the shooting was only the beginning of another fight. Thompson, Colburn and Androtter had demonstrated something that would become central to understanding My Lai. Soldiers were capable of recognizing that the orders and behavior around them were unlawful. Some members of Charlie Company had refused to kill, and Thompson's crew went considerably further, placing themselves between armed Americans and the people those Americans intended to kill. The excuse that soldiers had no choice was contradicted on the same morning, in the same village, by other American servicemen who chose differently. Their actions did not immediately make them heroes. For years, Thompson would be attacked for turning against fellow Americans. When he later testified about My Lai, some members of Congress were more interested in condemning him than celebrating what he had done. The Army itself would not formally honor Thompson, Colburn and Androtter with the Soldier's Medal until 1998, 30 years after the massacre. Androtter, who was killed in Vietnam only weeks after My Lai, received his medal posthumously. But on March 16, 1968, none of them knew how history would judge them. They knew only what they could see from their helicopter. Unarmed people were being killed, the people doing it were Americans, and somebody had to intervene. Thompson reported what he had witnessed and expected the military system to respond. Parts of that system did respond. Other parts immediately began turning My Lai into something else entirely, a successful combat operation in which American troops had supposedly killed scores of enemy fighters. The massacre was over, but the cover-up was beginning. Chapter 4: The Cover-Up. By the afternoon of March 16, 1968, the Army had two radically different versions of what had happened at My Lai. Hugh Thompson and other helicopter personnel had reported Americans killing civilians. On the ground, however, the operation was being recorded as a remarkable military success, with an extraordinarily high enemy body count and almost no American casualties. Before the day was over, the official version was already moving up the chain of command. The public announcement said American division troops had killed 128 enemy soldiers near Quang Nai. Reports described a fierce engagement supported by artillery and helicopter gunships, even though Charlie Company had encountered virtually no resistance and recovered very few enemy weapons. The discrepancy should have been obvious. A company supposedly had killed more than 100 Viet Cong while suffering no combat deaths, yet there was little evidence that a major enemy force had ever been present. Specialist J. Roberts, an Army public information soldier who had accompanied the operation, knew something was wrong. He had seen dead civilians and returned disturbed by what he had witnessed. When he questioned Task Force Barker Commander Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker about the huge body count and shortage of captured weapons, Barker offered no convincing explanation. Roberts later testified that the version he produced was rewritten as it moved through Army public information channels until the operation emerged as another battlefield victory. Thompson's reports also reached officers above Charlie Company. Colonel Orrin Henderson, commander of the 11th Infantry Brigade, was informed that civilians had been killed and flew over the area himself. Rather than triggering an independent criminal investigation, the allegations produced an internal inquiry controlled by the same command structure responsible for the operation. Henderson eventually reported that roughly 20 civilians had been unintentionally killed, largely through artillery and other combat fire. The possibility that American soldiers had deliberately murdered hundreds of people effectively disappeared from the official account. The cover-up did not require every officer involved to meet secretly and agree on a full story. It worked through smaller decisions. Suspicious numbers were accepted. Explanations were not challenged. Reports were softened as they moved upward. Witnesses who described atrocities were discounted while officers relied on statements from the units whose conduct was being questioned. The later Peers inquiry identified 30 people who had known of killings or other serious offenses but had failed to report them properly, suppressed information, failed to order adequate investigations, or failed to follow up on investigations that had begun. Responsibility extended beyond the men who had pulled triggers. Major General Samuel Coster commanded the Americal Division. Henderson commanded the brigade, and Barker commanded the task force responsible for the operation. The Peers investigation would eventually conclude that serious failures had occurred at brigade and division level as information about My Lai was ignored or concealed. Barker himself could never answer the later inquiry. He was killed in a helicopter crash in Vietnam in May 1968, 2 months after the massacre. For the Army, the false account worked remarkably well. My Lai disappeared into the enormous stream of combat reports coming from Vietnam. There was no immediate national scandal, no photographs on American front pages, and no announcement that hundreds of civilians had been massacred. To anyone reading the official reports, March 16 had been another successful operation against the Viet Cong. But the story survived among the soldiers who had been there. Men talked about what they had seen and done, sometimes to friends who had not participated in the operation. One of those men was Ronald Ridenhour, a helicopter gunner who had not been at My Lai during the massacre. Over the following months, he began hearing remarkably similar accounts from people who had been there. Instead of deciding that what happened in Vietnam should remain in Vietnam, Ridenhour started asking questions. Eventually, he decided that the army was not going to investigate My Lai unless somebody forced it to. Nearly a year after the massacre, Ridenhour sat down and began writing letters describing what he had learned. He sent them not just to military officials, but to members of Congress and senior figures in Washington. The cover-up had kept My Lai hidden for months, but one soldier was about to make it much harder to keep hidden. Chapter 5, The Letter. Ronald Ridenhour had not been at My Lai on March 16, 1968. He learned about it afterward, while still serving in Vietnam, from soldiers who had either witnessed the massacre or participated in it. At first, the stories sounded almost impossible. But Ridenhour kept asking questions, and different men described the same basic event. American soldiers had entered a village and deliberately killed large numbers of civilians. Ridenhour began collecting names and details. Some soldiers spoke reluctantly, while others described the killings with disturbing casualness. By the time he returned to the United States, he was convinced that something enormous had happened and that the army had successfully hidden it. In March 1969, roughly a year after the massacre, he wrote a detailed letter describing what he had learned and sent copies throughout Washington, including to the Pentagon, the White House and 24 members of Congress. Most of the politicians who received it did little. But Ridenhour had distributed the information too widely for it simply to disappear. The army began a criminal investigation in April 1969, interviewing men who had served with Charlie Company and slowly reconstructing what had occurred. Investigators discovered that the official story of a major fight with Viet Cong forces was impossible to reconcile with what witnesses were telling them. In September, the army charged Lieutenant William Calley with murdering Vietnamese civilians. Even then, My Lai remained largely unknown outside the military. The charges themselves attracted little attention. Vietnam was producing an enormous volume of news, casualty figures and military proceedings, and the accusation against a relatively obscure junior officer could easily have remained another minor story. Then Seymour Hersh heard about Calley. Hersh was a freelance investigative reporter who had previously worked for the Associated Press. He learned that an army lieutenant had been accused of murdering civilians in Vietnam and began trying to find him. Hersh eventually located Calley at Fort Benning, Georgia, and spent hours interviewing him. The story Calley initially presented was one of combat, enemy resistance and soldiers doing their jobs. But Hersh continued talking to people connected with Charlie Company, and the scale of what he was investigating became increasingly clear. Major publications were not immediately interested. Hersh eventually took the story to the small dispatch news service. On November 13, 1969, more than 18 months after the massacre, his first account of My Lai began appearing in American newspapers. The story described an American officer accused of directing the killing of scores of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. More reports followed as Hersh located additional soldiers. One of the most important was Paul Medlow, a former member of Calley's platoon. Medlow admitted participating in the killings and described shooting groups of civilians after being ordered to do so by Calley. Hersh also interviewed Medlow's mother, Myrtle. Her reaction captured something larger than the criminal responsibility of one soldier. She had sent her son into the army, she said, and he had returned as someone capable of participating in mass murder. Hersh's reporting made it increasingly impossible to portray My Lai as an invented allegation against a single officer. Then the public saw the photographs. Ronald Ridenhour had returned from Vietnam with the color photographs he had taken using his personal camera at My Lai. In November 1969, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published several of them. They showed bodies of women, children and elderly villagers lying along roads and paths. Until then, readers could debate testimony, military terminology and competing accounts. The photographs removed much of that distance. The army could no longer contain the story inside its own investigative system. Members of Congress demanded answers. Reporters began locating witnesses. Soldiers who had remained silent were now being questioned about what they had seen, and the credibility of the original army investigation was collapsing. For more than a year, My Lai had officially been a victory. Now Americans were learning that the enemy body count had largely been civilians, that soldiers had reported the killings almost immediately, and that the truth had still remained hidden. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened at My Lai. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. The question was who would be held responsible, and the army was about to discover that proving a massacre had occurred was much easier than deciding whom to punish for it. Chapter 6: The Trial. Once the massacre became public, the army faced a problem much larger than William Calley. Its own investigation had uncovered evidence of killings, assaults, false reports and failures extending through the chain of command. 13 soldiers were ultimately charged with murder-related offenses arising from My Lai, while officers also faced charges connected with the failure to investigate or report what had happened. Yet nearly all of those cases collapsed before producing convictions. In the end, only Calley would be found guilty. Calley's court-martial began at Fort Benning, Georgia, in November 1970. The prosecution's case did not depend on proving that Calley had personally killed every victim attributed to his platoon. Witnesses testified that he had ordered soldiers to shoot groups of unarmed civilians and had participated in the killings himself. Former soldier Paul Medlow described firing into villagers after Calley ordered him to do so, including people gathered near the irrigation ditch. The defense argued that Calley had been following orders. His attorneys maintained that Captain Ernest Medina had instructed Charlie Company to destroy the enemy in My Lai and that Calley believed he was carrying out the mission he had been given. The argument turned the trial into something larger than the actions of one lieutenant. If Calley had understood his orders to include killing civilians, where had that understanding come from, and how far upward should responsibility extend? The legal answer was clear on one point. An order to murder unarmed civilians was unlawful, and a soldier was not entitled to obey it simply because a superior had issued it. The evidence from My Lai also made the idea of helpless obedience difficult to sustain. Some soldiers had refused to kill. Hugh Thompson and his helicopter crew had actively intervened to protect civilians. People in the same place, under the same military authority, had made different choices. On March 29, 1971, the military jury convicted Calley of premeditated murder. He was found guilty in connection with the deaths of 22 Vietnamese civilians. The following day, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. Of all the soldiers accused of murdering civilians at My Lai, Calley was the only one convicted. The verdict produced an immediate political reaction. Calley had become a strangely sympathetic figure for many Americans, including people who believed he was being made a scapegoat for decisions made far above his rank. Some saw him as a murderer. Others saw an inexperienced junior officer being punished for a brutal war created by generals and politicians. Those two ideas were not necessarily mutually exclusive, but public debate often treated them as though they were. President Richard Nixon intervened almost immediately. Rather than allowing Calley to remain in military confinement while his case was reviewed, Nixon ordered that he be returned to his quarters at Fort Benning and kept under house arrest. The intervention angered Captain Aubrey Daniel, the Army prosecutor who had secured the conviction. Daniel wrote directly to Nixon, arguing that presidential interference threatened the military justice system and undermined the principle that soldiers were responsible for unlawful acts. Calley's sentence was subsequently reduced through the military review process. Instead of spending decades in prison, he remained confined to his quarters. In 1974, after roughly 3.5 years, he was released. The only man convicted for the killings at My Lai had served a fraction of his original life sentence. Captain Medina was also prosecuted, accused of responsibility for the killings committed by the company he commanded. His court-martial ended in acquittal. Cases against other officers and enlisted men similarly failed, were dismissed, or never reached trial. The result created an extraordinary imbalance between the scale of the massacre and the legal consequences that followed it. Hundreds of civilians had been killed, numerous soldiers had participated, and an elaborate failure of command had allowed the truth to remain hidden. Yet the American justice system produced one conviction. That made Calley both guilty and convenient. His actions were documented, and the jury found him criminally responsible. But concentrating responsibility on one lieutenant also made it possible to imagine My Lai as the work of a single rogue officer rather than the product of failures stretching through a military organization. The Army's own peers' inquiry had reached a much broader conclusion. The trials were ending, but the deeper investigation had already shown that My Lai could not be explained by William Calley alone. The next question was how an American military unit had reached the point where mass killing was possible, and why so many people above it had failed to stop the crime or expose it afterward. Chapter 7: The Peers' Inquiry. By the time William Calley went on trial, the Army had already conducted a much broader investigation into My Lai. Lieutenant General William Peers was appointed in November 1969 to examine not only the killings, but what commanders had known about them and why the Army's original investigations had failed. His inquiry eventually produced thousands of pages of testimony and evidence. The conclusions made it impossible to describe My Lai simply as the actions of one rogue lieutenant. The inquiry found serious failures throughout Task Force Barker and the 11th Infantry Brigade. Officers had failed to investigate reports of civilian deaths properly, misleading information had entered official reports, and people who knew or suspected that crimes had occurred had not acted on what they knew. Peers also examined the culture surrounding Charlie Company before the massacre. Soldiers had been operating in an environment where Vietnamese civilians were frequently regarded as potential enemies, while casualties from mines and booby traps increased anger against people who could not easily be distinguished from guerrillas. Leadership failed to keep that anger from becoming permission to disregard the laws of war. Training was another problem. Evidence collected by the inquiry showed deficiencies in soldiers' understanding of the Geneva Conventions, the laws governing treatment of civilians and procedures for reporting suspected war crimes. The larger failure, however, was not simply that men had forgotten rules taught in classrooms. Commanders had allowed the values of the unit to drift far enough that criminal behavior could become acceptable to soldiers who still considered themselves loyal members of the Army. The system used to measure success in Vietnam made matters worse. Enemy body counts had become an important indicator of battlefield performance, particularly in operations where territory could be occupied temporarily and then abandoned. When success was expressed in numbers of enemy dead, there was an obvious danger if commanders stopped asking who those dead actually were. My Lai produced a large body count long before anyone produced evidence of a corresponding enemy force. The peers' inquiry also demonstrated how an institutional cover-up can occur without a single master plan. One officer accepts an implausible explanation. Another fails to interview witnesses. Someone changes the wording of a report. A superior decides that pursuing allegations would damage the unit. By the time the information reaches headquarters, a massacre can appear on paper as a successful combat operation. The inquiry identified numerous officers and soldiers whose failures contributed either to the crime itself or to its concealment. Yet the investigation produced an uncomfortable contrast. The Army was capable of determining in extraordinary detail how My Lai had happened. It reconstructed orders, communications, helicopter movements, killings and failures of command. Congress investigated as well. There was no shortage of evidence that responsibility extended beyond Calley. What was missing was comparable punishment. Criminal cases against other participants and commanders either failed, were dismissed or ended in acquittal. Administrative consequences were imposed on some officers, but nothing approached the scale of the massacre itself. Hundreds of Vietnamese civilians had died, yet only one American was convicted for killing them. That disparity helped shape the argument over My Lai for decades. Some Americans used the broader command failures to portray Calley as a scapegoat, as though responsibility above him somehow erased responsibility below. The peers' findings pointed toward a different conclusion. Calley could be responsible for his own decisions while commanders, soldiers and institutions were simultaneously responsible for theirs. Responsibility did not have to stop at one level simply because it existed at another. My Lai had now been investigated, photographed, exposed and prosecuted. The facts were no longer hidden. What remained was the question that often survives after a true crime case is legally finished: what did justice actually accomplish? For the families of My Lai, the answer was painfully little. Chapter 8: What Remained. My Lai did not end when the trials ended. The massacre became one of the defining crimes of the Vietnam War, not only because of the number of people killed, but because Americans eventually learned how many opportunities there had been to stop it, report it and punish those responsible. The Army's own Peers inquiry documented failures throughout the operation and its aftermath. Yet after hundreds of civilians had been killed, William Calley remained the only person convicted of a crime for the massacre. The case exposed the limits of treating atrocities as the work of a few uniquely evil individuals. Calley committed murder and ordered others to commit murder. That did not make the conduct of his commanders irrelevant. The officers who failed to control their units, the people who accepted impossible body counts, and those who allowed misleading reports to move through the army all played different roles in what happened. Responsibility could exist simultaneously at every level. My Lai also demonstrated why following orders cannot settle the question of individual responsibility. On March 16, soldiers faced the same command structure and made radically different choices. Some participated in killing. Some refused. Hugh Thompson, Glenn Androtter and Lawrence Colburn went much further, deliberately putting themselves between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. Their behavior proved, in the middle of the massacre itself, that obedience was not inevitable. Recognition came slowly. In 1998, 30 years after My Lai, the Army awarded Thompson, Androtter and Colburn the Soldier's Medal, its highest decoration for heroism not involving combat with an enemy. Androtter, who had been killed in Vietnam less than 3 weeks after My Lai, received the award posthumously. The Army cited the crew for risking their lives to save Vietnamese civilians from American forces. The contrast with Calley was extraordinary. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment, but ultimately spent roughly 3 years confined, much of it under house arrest. Decades later, in 2009, he finally made a public apology. He said he felt remorse for the Vietnamese who had been killed, their families and the American soldiers involved. Calley lived for another 15 years and died in April 2024 at the age of 80. No later apology could repair what had happened in the hamlets of Sun Mai. Families had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Children who survived grew old carrying memories of relatives killed around them. For them, My Lai was not primarily a symbol of an unpopular war, an argument about military ethics or a case studied in command schools. It was the morning their families died. For the American military, however, My Lai became a permanent warning about command responsibility and moral courage. Army examinations of the massacre continued to use it when discussing leadership, unlawful orders, reporting misconduct and the danger of loyalty becoming obedience to wrongdoing. The lesson is not merely that soldiers must refuse obviously criminal orders. Leaders must create units in which recognizing civilians as civilians, questioning unlawful conduct and reporting crimes are treated as obligations rather than betrayals. There is another reason My Lai remains important. The truth did not emerge because the system worked smoothly. Hugh Thompson complained while the massacre was happening. Ronald Ridenhour spent months collecting accounts and then wrote to officials throughout Washington. Seymour Hersh pursued a story major publications initially showed little interest in. Ronald Hebberl's photographs eventually allowed the public to see what official reports had concealed. My Lai became known because individuals repeatedly refused to accept the easier version of events. That is where the true crime story of My Lai ultimately ends. Hundreds of people were murdered. The crime was disguised as a military victory. The cover-up eventually failed, an enormous investigation reconstructed what happened, and only one person was convicted. The most enduring American heroes of the story were not the men who fought most aggressively, but 3 servicemen who were willing to point their weapons toward their own side rather than allow another group of civilians to be killed. My Lai leaves behind no satisfying version of justice. What it offers instead is evidence of how institutions can fail, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary crimes, and how a handful of people can still choose not to go along. Next time on AI True Crime, we leave the battlefield for San Francisco in the 1970s and a killer whose identity remains uncertain more than half a century later, the Doodler.
AI True Crime. AI True Crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crimes are real. Really, really real. AI True Crime.